This is Bonjour Chai, the Jews Against the Omnicause edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltzbovy. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we have a lively discussion with Hadley Freeman about the Omnicause, this new phenomenon where climate, Palestine, trans rights, everything becomes one cause, all for cause and cause for all. We get into by-elections in Toronto and in the US and shifting voting patterns for the Jewish community. And of course, we get into Haredim and the IDF. Will they actually serve because of the Supreme Court ruling? Who knows? All this and more coming up. Phoebe, how are you?
All right. How are you doing, Avi?
I am doing well. We are between the two holidays, Fête Nationale in Quebec and the Canada Day in Canada for the rest of Canada and in Quebec. How are you spending your upcoming long weekend as a Canadian for the first time?
Yes. Well, I am draped in head-to-toe Canadian flags. They're pinned to everything I own. No, I know that school is closed and daycare is closed, so I'm making a note of that, making a note that it's a Take Care of Children Day. How about you, Avi? What have you got going?
I will be in Canada, actually.
Oh, how very appropriate.
As longtime listeners of the show know, it is a very stressful day for me because my wife, my mother, and my country all have the same birthday. And we have a wedding that day. So I can wish a mazel tov to a longtime listener whose wedding we are co-officiating, me and my wife. So Michael and Diva, mazel tov. Let's go on to our feature interview. Hadley Freeman has come back to Bonjour Chai. You interviewed her last time about her memoir, I believe. Mm-hmm. And today we are going to talk about the cause to end all causes, the most important cause of them all, the Omnicause.
We are thrilled to have back on Hadley Freeman, a wonderful writer who's the author most recently of the memoir Good Girls, who is a columnist and features writer at the Times of London. She also wrote the Jewish Quarterly article for the May 2024 issue called Blindness, October 7th of the Left. I say article, even though it's more like a book-length essay. It's amazing. And she also writes for the Jewish Chronicle. And the reason we have her on today is to discuss the Omnicause, because Hadley wrote a really fun piece called Welcome to the Omnicause, the Fatberg of Activism. So Hadley, welcome back to Bonjour Chai, and I have a question for you. So I saw somebody walk by in my sort of liberal Toronto bourgeois kind of Brooklyn type neighborhood wearing a t-shirt that said queer as in free Palestine with a watermelon on it. Is this the Omnicause?
That is 100% the Omnicause. That t-shirt is the Omnicause. Greta Thunberg in a keffiyeh is an Omnicause. Just this random grouping together of very disparate issues that come from very different parts of the world, I would even say, and insisting that they're all part of the Western progressive left cause is the Omnicause.
And are there any left-wing causes that do not get subsumed by the Omnicause? Like, is there anything that the Omnicause is like, nope, not interesting, not going on a flyer, not going on a t-shirt?
Sure, feminism. They're not very interested in that at all. Anti-Semitism, not interested in that. It's entirely about gender and sexuality and Gaza. That is the and climate, of course. It's just, if you support one, you're expected to support all of them.
So it's a misnomer in a sense, in that the Omnicause is anything but omni,
yeah.
In terms of what its positions are.
Well, in the sort of same way that inclusive is anything but inclusive. It's just very limited rubric who's included in inclusivity. So I'm going up to Glastonbury on Wednesday, which I'm sure your listeners know is this music festival that happens in some...
I'm not sure they do in North America.
I'm not sure listeners know what the Fatberg is.
Yeah. Well, at Glastonbury, they always have this one bit of the festival. It's a big music festival that goes on for about 4 days, where people can make speeches. It's a very left-wing kind of festival. And I looked what was happening there on my first day when I arrived. And the first speech that day is about trans liberation. And the second speech that day is about liberate Palestine. So, it's full-on Omnicause-tastic at Glastonbury this year.
I see. Well, I hope there's some good T-shirts coming out of that. So I saw, I was trying to figure out where Omnicause was coined, and I saw that it was attributed to a tweet that was in response to a lesbian club at Columbia University, and this was the fall or the winter or something, hosting a No Zionists film night, Was that, do you think, the first time Omnicause was used, or does this have some sort of longer history?
Yeah, someone sent me a direct message after I wrote that piece saying they'd found it used in a paper in 2022, referring to lots of different kind of conspiracy theories and Omnicause, like fears of vaccines, fears of government being, I don't know, taken over by Russia or China or whoever. So that was the Omnicause. And Daniel Finkelstein, who's a really interesting columnist at the Times, wrote this piece about, he doesn't call it the Omnicause, he calls it linkage, when far left or far right join up different causes, almost like a kind of gateway entryism. So like if you're interested in climate change, like most people are, here, let us tell you why it's also exactly the same as Palestine.
So how much does this predate October 7th, even if the name Omnicause is sort of newly making the rounds? Were left-wing causes linked in this way prior, and how much, do you think?
Well, so colleagues who are older than you and I, Phoebe, say that there were similar kind of movements in the early 80s, for example, sort of, Ban the Bomb and Free Nelson Mandela kind of all grouped together, similar in the 60s. But this time it's different, first of all, because a lot of what they're talking about now, a lot of the Omnicause people that I see and examples that I see have to do with focusing so strongly on Palestine and talking about justice, but not acknowledging Hamas. So it's a very blinkered form of Omnicause.
What's lost when all of these causes get lumped together? I keep thinking about how the climate change gets associated with this because, all the left is these are all these progressive ideas, Palestine, and you said trans, and those are very much, not opinions that are held on the right. If we even thought that maybe we can convince somebody on the right about climate change by lumping it in with other things that are a lot harder to convince, doesn't that make it more difficult? Like there's serious downsides, I guess, to creating omnicauses.
Totally.
And
totally.
What, are people talking about this and saying, we might actually not be doing anything good by coupling all of these issues together?
Totally. I mean, I'm very, interested in stopping climate change, like a lot of people. I don't necessarily want to then be joined up with groups who campaign for the right to change their child's sex, or groups who insist that Israel is all evil and Palestine is all noble. Like when things get lumped together like that, it's becoming more and more exclusionary. I see it as a kind of activist form of the way the language became a lot more exclusionary, particularly after 2020, when everyone had to be extra careful. There was very specific lingo. It's a way of keeping the out crowd from the in crowd, I think.
So I'm really glad you bring up 2020, because this is something I've been thinking about a bunch, which is just how much this current obsession with Palestine as the sort of anchor cause of the Omnicause. You mentioned that New York Times article that's sort of about all these American college students who had this epiphany that bad things are bad, and it was because of Gaza. And I'm wondering how much of this is just about basically that it's simple in a way because it's about alleviating white guilt post 2020 and having Jews be kind of the stand-ins for colonialism, white people being bad, capitalism, whatever, you know what I mean? So I wonder how much that's it, just because it's more fun to hate Jews apparently than to apologize for being white and listen. I don't know.
It's true. I'm really torn on this, maybe. I go back and forth. Is this about hating Jews? I think that is definitely a part of it, the obsession with Palestine and the evils of Israel. Or is this just the latest iteration of what we've seen a lot from the progressive left over the past decade, of trying to find one single source for all things wrong in the world, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's, white supremacy, whether it's heteronormativity, et cetera, et cetera. And now the latest single cause is Israel. Is it just by chance that that's the Jewish homeland? I don't think so. But I think it is part of that, this desire for things to be simple and to say, if we just got rid of this one thing, then everything would be fantastic.
It's like the ground unified theory of physics.
Totally.
There's not one omnicause. At the very least, there has to be at least two, because there's the anti-omnicause of the various packages on the right of what those opinions are. And again, I think that that's one of the downsides of saying we have an omnicause, basically are saying that anything that is not that, well, now we've told the other, side of who we oppose, this is the things that you have to oppose, and this is how you have to oppose them.
Yeah.
Anytime you have a group, though, there's this sense that, like, sometimes, and I think this is the downside of anything other than direct democracy, of collecting opinions together into various parties, into various groupings. how much of this is inevitable that we have to, sort of put things in progressive versus traditional versus conservative, sort of positions, and how much of this actually could be avoided by saying, let's try and recognize that different people have different opinions on things.
No, totally. I really don't understand the set menu approach to politics. Whereas, if you identify as a conservative, therefore you believe in lower taxes and your family values, et cetera, like nobody has a set menu of politics unless they are incredibly brainwashed. Like most people will believe in some liberal things. Most people will believe in a few conservative things. Most people will believe in some progressive things. Like that is how we all think. And in limiting leftist thinking to, you must believe that we must all be net zero and trans children are sacred and Palestine is great and Israel is evil, you are just making your group smaller and smaller. And I do think that is part of it.
If I can push back a little on that, though, isn't that what faith actually does? In preparing for this, I kept going into my mind of there's things that I believe in, as you just said. And then I was like, you know what? That's what Judaism is, right? If you accept the Torah and you're going to accept, law, and I'm not saying that you have to, but one who goes and chooses to submit, right, to a legal system of Judaism or of Islam or of, a set of beliefs from another faith or tradition, you're essentially saying, it's not up to me to make up what the values are and what the rules are. This is what God said. And the only difference is that God right here is the mob of beliefs. Yeah. But we do have times when, and historically for thousands of years, that is the role of faiths or of nations or of countries. Anytime you have a group of people that is so large, you're going to inevitably have things that you believe in, things you don't.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I do think a lot of this is taking the place of religion in a very secular world now in the West, knowing what is good and what is evil. But, I was raised extremely Reformed Jewish. And when my two boys were born, their dad is not Jewish. And we made a deal, which was that they'd have to go to Hebrew school every Saturday and be bar mitzvah, but I wouldn't circumcise them. So there we did a non-pick and mix menu to Judaism. I'm sure my boys love me talking about their non-circumcision on radio. So that's what I find strange. So many of these people who support the Omnicause or just automatically subscribe to a set menu version of politics would shun the idea of a kind of extreme religion or extreme observancy. I'm Jewish. I'm not ultra Orthodox. And I kind of see the same thing with my politics. Like I am liberal. I am not progressive.
This is also interesting. And I mean, I'm thinking as an American, I'm used to that you have to just pick at certain, in elections, you have to just pick, but that you don't necessarily, but it does feel new to me that you would have to personally adhere to all of it to that degree. Like that amount of polarization does feel new. But you mentioned gender a bit, and I want to ask about that specifically because what I've noticed is that it seems like when I already knew where somebody stood on sort of trans issues and feminism and so forth, I somehow knew before I knew where they stood on Israel stuff. And this seems to extend, surprisingly, beyond people who happen to be Jewish themselves. And I'm wondering, is this especially the case in the UK and something I was seeing because I was up in the middle of the night with little kids? Or is this especially not the case in the UK? Are there sort of gender critical feminists who are also really all in for Palestine? How does this sort of shake up?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Phoebe. I think it is different in the UK because the gender issue is not as politically polarized as it has been in the US and in Canada. So there are a lot of gender critical politicians on the right here, of course, but also on the left. And I'm friends with lots of very strong, very adamant gender critical women, socialists, lesbians. We all kind of meet each other at various things here. And some of them have fallen out with me or have said to me that they really disagree with me about Israel. A lot of, particularly ones who are women of color, for example, Middle Eastern women who are very gender critical for their, reasons that are probably exactly the same as yours and mine. It isn't as down the line as it probably is, I imagine, in America and Canada.
Right. I mean, I feel like I'm not super interested in these issues as it goes. And yet somehow because I feel like almost because I'm following other issues, I hear a lot about them. And I've had people, send me messages about something, somebody sent me a message recently about detransitioners. I'm like, I haven't written anything about detransitioner. I think you got the wrong person here. This isn't really one of my hobby horses, or areas of expertise or whatever. But yes, it is interesting because I do sometimes think that I can know from where somebody stood about one thing, like where they stand on 10 other things. And then I just start to get into this thing where I think, is that because they are just a good person and I'm just a terrible person? And that's why they have the right view on all the things. And but yeah, I do want to talk a little bit, though, about this global angle. So is there a different Omnicause in different places, or is this itself just sort of a globalization thing? Because what I've noticed post October 7th is that a lot of things being discussed as brand new strike me as, well, that was happening in France ages ago, but now it's just what's new is that it's happening elsewhere.
Yes, totally. And I think what I find so both hilarious and infuriating about the Omnicause, particularly as it's expressed in North America and in the UK, is that it's often talked about with this extreme ignorance about the rest of the world. There is no sense of knowledge from a lot of these people in the West who are campaigning, queer to Palestine, I'm queer as fuck for Palestine, whatever. They have no sense of what it would be like to be LGBT in Palestine, or that Israel has pride parades. That,
okay. So I do have to just push back on this, because I have seen, I've been researching this because of this T-shirt I saw. This is going to seem ridiculous.
Oh, yeah?
It seems like there is a sense, but that the party line, as it were, is that Israel is engaged in pinkwashing if promoting the fact that it is better in Israel to be gay than it is elsewhere in the Middle East.
I mean, is that pinkwashing, or is that actually a fact? And it's been a fact long before October the 7th and before the Omnicause, which is not Israel is the safest place in the Middle East to be gay. And there is something very colonializing about kids in the West, young university students in Canada, in America, in the UK, sort of importing their own attitudes and their own expectations of what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong onto countries in the Middle East that have totally different histories, totally different geopolitical situations, and totally different religious backgrounds. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly narcissistic.
In a sense, it's really reductionist, I'm finding. In that,
totally.
The first time that it occurred to me that this Omnicause was really reductionist was when I started hearing the term the global South, right? And how many people know what's going on in the global South, and they just refer to it as this this poor, it's like, here be dragons, anything below the equator, right? We don't even want to think about it. It's just they need our help, but we don't know or think about anything beyond there. And yet,
is that Australia in the global South?
Yeah, so in theory that's there, but nobody stops to think about that, and nobody stops to think about the incredibly westernized places in South America. You're right, that was in Buenos Aires. Right. It is not a third world country, So the reductionist approach is there, and then also the fact that once you've decided, and this, by the way, is true of religion as well, so once you've decided that X is a value, right, everything else gets bent around the discussion that is there. So once you've decided that Palestine is part of your cause, everything else has to be explained around that notion, right? So once you've decided that electricity is not used on Shabbat, then everything gets played around to make that work. And that's what's going on here as well. Totally.
It's interesting. I live in a part of North London that's quite old school lefty. And when I moved in here, there were loads of some older people who live in apartments around here who all had loads of, Palestine Free Gaza posters up in their windows that had clearly been there since the 1980s. And over the past few years, on the other side of the street where young university students have moved in, is suddenly all these trans flags have gone up. And you can sort of see the shifting of the causes and the combining of the causes. There have always been, sort of instinctive far left causes. And what's different now is these are very different causes that are being joined up, and like you say, in a very simplistic way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting what you say about the signs and stuff, because I just watch in the local coffee shop and the local bookstore as they just kind of keep it. They just build, right? So at first there's the sort of Black Lives Matter became Black Trans Lives Matter became ceasefire, and it's but they're not getting rid of the old signs, so it's it's becoming, there's not much window left, but it's mainly just signs. Yes. But I wanted to ask, and Avi and I both wanted to ask about sort of where Jews fit into this, because it seems like a lot of progressive Jews did support the Omnicause before October 7th and are now a bit adrift. And
totally.
I'm just sort of wondering, because of everything happening to, or for more sinister reasons, coalescing around Israel, are Jews the ones who are are Jews unusually critical of the Omnicause, or is this just something more widely shared among groups of people who sort of fall out of these neat boxes of oppressed or oppressor?
Yes, I think that's true. I also think, whereas before, if the Omnicauses were things like Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and gender issues, those were extremely sensitive issues that were discussed in a new way than they had been previously. Obviously, there had been, just long discussions about racism and particularly racism in America before, but this was a particularly heightened time, during the pandemic. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, there's a lot of people out there who know more than Greta Thunberg about Israel-Palestine. Like, this is an issue that's been talked about for a long time. So I think for some people who signed up to the pre-October 7th Omnicause, there's a bit of realization that maybe not all progressive lefts know everything that they're talking about, that there's a lot of ignorance being shared. The idea that Israel is all bad, Palestine's all good, is clearly an ignorant position. And I think it's harder to maintain that if you know anything about Middle East history.
Mm-hmm.
5 years ago, if you had asked somebody, or 10 years ago, if you'd asked somebody, is anti-Semitism like a thing of the past? And they'd be like, no, there's still anti-Semitism. Yes, it has largely been solved. And now we talk about it as if it's unprecedented. And then we have this hindsight of like, no, there has always been so much anti-Semitism. And the fact is that that's not necessarily true. Anti-Semitism was largely solved. And I suspect that that's one of the reasons why Jews got left out of intersectionality and now the Omnicause is this sense that, yes, you may have been oppressed for a long time, but you fought hard and you did, and now you succeeded, and now you're at the highest levels of business. And Jews like to talk internally about how much we've succeeded, despite whatever. And now you want to go and say, no, we're so intersectional, right? We're also part of this oppressed class, right? You don't get to have it both ways. And this is where, to a certain extent, I kind of sympathize with the Omnicause, where they you were doing okay for a long time, and whether it was for you did it on purpose or not, but the Palestinians are not, and we're going to side with them now because that's what we believe is the ones that are oppressed, and you're on that outer circle of oppression and they're on the inner circle.
Yes, or is it that people can only sympathize with Jews when they're being the victims? This was when the attitude towards Israel changed after the Six-Day War, and Israel became the aggressor, and suddenly Western governments and Charles de Gaulle and people like that were calling, we're condemning Israel for having taken the initiative and blowing up the Egyptian Air Force before the war actually started. So is it that Jews are only sympathetic when they're victims? But I think you're right. I think there is a problem with that. Jews did assimilate in the West largely and did succeed. And therefore, this idea that Jews could ever be singled out or under threat has, fallen to the wayside. Whatever, obviously there have been killings of Jews in America, in France, in the UK, in recent years. But it obviously is not on the same scale as 150 years ago. There was a similar thing with women. When women started speaking out against gender ideology and saying this is putting us in danger, having males have access to our spaces or, whatever, people didn't take it seriously because I think a lot of people thought, well, feminism's been sorted. We had the Me Too movement. What are you complaining about?
I was just thinking about sort of Jews as a stand-in, and I think this is where I think there is some crossover with either white women or privileged women or however it gets phrased, but just this idea that there are these groups of people who kind of come to represent liberalism and who get kind of embraced by people who are pro-liberalism, but as an idea, not as necessarily real people, and more sort of urgently are opposed by the people who oppose liberalism and who just sort of associate Jews with this kind of like powers that be. And then you have this to my mind, extremely weird thing. There was an article about this, I think, in the Free Press about Jews as the new normies or something, about like the frat boys as representative of Jews. And this just seemed so weird to me because like I did not grow up thinking of Jews as like on the side of frat boys. Like, yes, there would be like the Jewish frat, but frat boys were something else. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just obsessed with this thing where fighting anti-Semitism is now conservative coded. And that just, unless you give a whole caveat about like, really, it's worse. The real anti-Semitism is from the right. And unless you say that, then it's conservative coded.
Sure.
Let's just put it, I'm going to put it in really simple terms. If somebody has an Israeli flag emoji in their bio and they're not Jewish, and they're just like a friend of Israel's, what would you assume are their politics, left or right?
Probably right.
Yeah.
But that I think that is largely related to the government in Israel, which is very right wing.
That's true also.
And therefore supporting Zionism and, fighting anti-Semitism has become associated with being right wing. But yeah, I agree. The idea, I understand, people see Jews as being successful disproportionately so and all the rest of it. But the idea of Jews being, like you say, the frat boys, I find hilarious. These people clearly never went to Jewish summer camp in Maine in the 1990s. Is all I can say. None of us did any sport at all. We all stayed in the arts and crafts cabin.
That's yet another place where, as a community, the attempt to flatten this discussion and to say, if you are anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? And nowadays Zionism is right-wing, right? Fed into that notion that if you are not on the side of Israel right now, if you're anything left of extreme right-wing politics right now, then you're automatically on the other side. And had we done more to create more diversity in terms of thinking about Zionism, that also would not have come back to bite us.
But I just also don't understand why not everything, but why these kinds of discussions have to be so all or nothing. You're either entirely pro-Israel, you're entirely pro-Palestine, you're entirely pro-fighting racism, or you're entirely pro-thinking all this talk is ridiculous. Whatever happened to a bit of nuance and mix?
I couldn't agree more. I'm in the middle of writing a very big piece specifically on that. But I guess I'm curious as to what can one do then, what the prescription might be for the future to go and say, well, if we had our way, what would replace an Omnicause?
How do we break up the fatberg?
How do we break up? Exactly. Do we have to explain that? I know I mentioned it briefly before.
The fatberg. So I love
this idea. So a fatberg, if I can tell me if I'm wrong, from what I understand, there's two things you're not supposed to flush or put into the waste system. One is food-based oils that are waste oils and fats. And the other one is flushable wipes, which despite the fact that it has flushable in the title, it is not flushable. And those two things in these sewer systems coalesce and congeal together to form an iceberg, which, by the way, fatberg, I think is an anti-Semitic term because of its connection to Greenberg and Goldberg and fatberg. So I'm going to call you out on that one.
Sure, fair enough. It's the Schmendrick fatberg. Yes. I love fatbergs. There was a big phase for a while in this country where sewage people kept finding these gigantic fatbergs, and each one was bigger than the next. This one was bigger than Buckingham Palace. This one was bigger than Big Ben. And I just think it is a little bit like that, where it's just very lazy thinking gets all glommed together, and people are so desperate to be thought of as good and to make a very complicated world seem simple. They just patch all these very complicated ideas together in a very simplistic way. I just think if any of these people ever went to, for example, Israel and the West Bank and parts of Palestine, they would see that it's impossible to have an all or nothing view of these countries and what's happening between them. And if they read any history, which they could just Wikipedia, they would realize the same thing. Things are incredibly complicated. It's not, Israel is not the racist white cop and Palestine is not George Floyd. But it seems that that's what people want. They want to have the gotcha of being like, you believe the bad stuff, therefore I can hate you with impunity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's leave it at that. Hadley, you are welcome back anytime. And thanks for so much great discussion.
Well, thank you so much for having me, both of you.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
So much stuff happened in the world this week.
Specifically, we're going to talk about some new election results across North America, by which I mean Canada and the US, as usual. Not to do any sort of erasure of Mexico here. But basically, yes, so two candidates won elections seemingly because Israel. Maybe, maybe not. Discuss. But first, we're going to discuss and explain what we're talking about. Avi, do you want to start with it, being that this is the Canadian Jewish news? Do you want to start with the Canadian one? What's a riding? What's a Canada? Please explain.
What's a Canada? A Canada is what happens when, instead of fighting against a imperialist force and saying we want our independence, you wait a little while and you say, can we please go now? And they're like, sure, you can have your independence, and everything is peaceful and everything's great. That's a Canada. What happens is that it then gets broken up into ridings. That is the lowest common space in the federal.
It's a voting district?
It's a voting district, yes.
Okay.
And the riding of Toronto St. Paul's had a by-election this week. The Conservative candidate, Don Stewart, defeated the Liberal candidate, Leslie Church. This was one of the safest seats considered historically for the Liberal Party, and they lost it. And a lot of people are seeing this as a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister and his handling of a variety of different things. I know that a lot of people are blaming the Jews, or not blaming, but are saying that it's because the Jews have switched their votes to the Conservative candidate. Look, the NDP got 10% of the vote, which could have been a spoiler. Also, there was, I think, 82 possible candidates in this one riding, so that was also an issue. There was a lot going on in this riding, but it is definitely true that the Jews in the riding seem to overwhelmingly have switched their vote from the Liberal Party to the Conservative Party.
So moving from the technical term of riding to the colloquial term of neighborhood, is this a Jewish neighborhood? Because I know it a little bit, just because one of my kids has a doctor that I guess is technically in this riding. So I've been through it. To me, compared to the neighborhood I live in, this seems like quite a Jewish neighborhood, measured by certain food products, certain signage of hostage flyers versus parachute flyers, but also vibes, Judar, things of that nature.
Yeah, so my sense...
Is that right?
Yes, my sense is that it's not like one of the heavily Jewish ridings of Toronto, but it definitely has a Jewish presence enough to sway, to make a difference. Jews across Canada have been talking about this and saying how Trudeau has let them down, the Liberal Party has let them down. I think the wider consensus is that the Liberal Party just seems to be dropping the ball, period, across everything that they're doing, and they're just banking on the fact that the Conservative Party wasn't. And I'm not a pundit, but my sense is that the Jews are disappointed with the people that they've traditionally voted for and are moving to the person who is waving a flag for Israel, Pierre Poilievre, and his consigliere, former host Melissa Lantzman. At some point, you're no longer I don't know when. It's like she was there for 3 months. And
former host of this show.
Of this show, yes. Bonjour, hi. I'm just digressing and realizing that Phoebe has been in
it's like trivia to me that I find fascinating. That those are the shoes I'm filling here. Is always kind of a little hilarious to me, because I'm like, what's a riding? And you're like, as the major politician who used to have your role.
Yes. What
conservative means in Canada and what conservative means in the United States. Would you say these are the same, Avi, or a little bit different?
They used to be more different than they are now, and they are now, the gap is narrowing.
Oh, right? Really? So I'm not sure about that.
My sense used to be that when you were part of the Conservative Party in Canada, you were basically a fiscal conservative, but socially there were a lot of solved issues and there wasn't a big deal. But now that things are moving in a certain direction in America, the conservatives in Canada are basically saying, hey, we want to think about this too. We want to put everything back on the table in terms of the values, quote unquote, that we hold. And, they're moving in the direction more towards where American conservatives are.
So as in guns, abortion, healthcare, you think that's all on the table?
I think that they want abortion back on the table. I think they want medical assistance in dying to be on the table. Guns is going to be a much harder sell, although I know that conservatives in Canada do wish they had more access to guns the way that Americans do. This despite the fact that the U.S. just said that gun violence is a public health crisis right now. So all of this is up in the air.
Sure.
And I don't know.
What I was going to say is that I think that the way I see it, being Canadian and American at this point, it seems kind of like there's more squickiness for American Jews about going to the right wing in America because it seems further right. It seems not in line with the values of Jews outside of the sort of rural areas where there just aren't a lot of Jews and so forth. So like it's a harder sell, like voting Republican. It's not that there are plenty of Jews voting Republican, but there are a lot of Jews who are going to be squicked out by voting Republican in a way that maybe there wouldn't be as many Canadian Jews squicked out by voting Conservative. Is that possible?
I think that's true likely because of the leader of the American Republican Party currently right now, which is, Donald Trump. And I think that the line is not Jewish or religious or not religious. It's very much Zionist versus how not Zionist you feel. And that the more Zionist you feel, the more you're willing to put all your cards in with the Republican Party because of their support of Israel.
So I would maybe push back a little against that and say that in the US, because the Democratic Party has been traditionally kind of for a while now, a comfortable home for the center left and people who might be considered center right in Canada, even if you're putting Israel as one of your top priorities, you wouldn't have to vote Republican on that basis. And that's been kind of a harder sell for Republicans relatively. And that gets me to the election that happened in the US I was going to talk about, where Jamal Bowman lost his congressional seat in a Democratic primary to somebody named George Latimer, who I did not know. Bowman is, or was, I don't know if it's considered was at this point, a member of the Squad with AOC. Mm-hmm. So this group of very progressive, somewhat younger politicians who have been, by and large, much more pro-Palestinian than one might expect from the Democratic Party. They're kind of more aligned with Bernie Sanders, though, so it's not all it's not all identity-based or new to politics-based, all of this. But these are sort of like younger, more socialist-oriented politicians, more like what would be kind of maybe closer to NDP, perhaps, than you would normally get in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And the significance of this election result in Westchester is kind of similar, I think, to the significance of this Canadian one. So Westchester, it's a suburban area. So this district, it's not a riding, also includes some of the Bronx, but basically it's just suburbs, right? Like some wealthy, some not wealthy, just suburbs that are near New York. So obviously there are going to be a lot of Jews. And this is complicated because you could say, okay, is it just that, people have had it with this far left politics? Is that just the voters are having their say? Or is it that there's a lot of money that was put towards having this Latimer guy win, which it sounds like there was from something affiliated with AIPAC. So
yeah, I saw the money piece of it, and I don't know enough about it.
But then there are other pieces of it too, which is that Bowman was in trouble for ringing a fire alarm in Congress. He's had some issues. He's said things about October 7th. So I'm not sure what it all means, apart from the fact that there is this kind of center. The center left in America is maybe the center right in Canada to some extent.
My takeaway from it is that for a lot of Jews, if you consider yourself a Zionist and you're moving yourself on the right of where Israel should be and the right of Israel to do whatever it's doing over the past several months in Gaza, the more you believe in that, the more you're automatically turned off, regardless of what the other party is saying, you're turned off by anybody who aligns themselves with Palestine.
I would also say, even if you are highly critical of the way Israel's been handling things, if you see one side has a keffiyeh, a watermelon emoji, and is like all in for Palestine, and the other side is like, it's complicated, you might also go with the it's complicated side. Like,
I'm curious what'll happen when there's an actual election. I think that, if you look at my former home riding of Mount Royal in Montreal, where Anthony Housefather has had the seat, where it's been a strong liberal riding, they just nominated this guy, Neil Oberman, for the Conservative Party's candidacy whenever there's an election. And he's going to be a very strong candidate. he's the lawyer that defended the Jewish community for these injunctions against protesting in front of various Jewish communal buildings. And he's kind of a hero right now because he has done great for the Jews. And this is despite the fact that Anthony has really also shown himself to be a staunch supporter of Israel. The fact that he is considered a lone wolf now in the Liberal Party is going to be a big negative for him, I think.
So what I've been noticing really since October is the way that fighting anti-Semitism has become kind of a right-wing coded thing to do. If somebody has, we've talked about, like, if somebody says they're a big supporter of Israel, we would assume that they're probably on the right, things like that. This is something we've been talking about for months now. But at the same time, there is still right-wing anti-Semitism that has not gone anywhere. There are also things other than anti-Semitism or Israel that Jews care about, because Jews are people in the world with other concerns. So I think it just depends how it all shakes up. Like, I think it's unlikely in the US that Jews are going to turn away from the Democratic Party. I think, and I'm thinking now more towards the general election, like the presidential election. Are Jews going to be all in for Donald Trump? It's hard to picture that. I think he's been trying for ages.
Some Jews are, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at. That
some are, and some are, and some are. Well, I wouldn't say there's a huge
AIPAC. The entire world that follows the AIPAC model is all in for Trump. There are very few people that are members of AIPAC that.
But I'm saying demographically, American Jews I think are going to continue voting Democrat. I think in Canada, to me, this seems much more mysterious, partly just because I know less about Canadian politics, but also because I don't know that there'd be so much of a stigma against voting conservative, precisely because if you tell somebody in America that you're going to vote Republican, you would get what? You think abortion should be illegal? What? You think there should be, guns everywhere? That's what you're going to get people saying, and they won't really be wrong. I think it's just different. It's a different thing, culturally and in terms of actual policies. Yeah. We'll see. We will stay tuned.
We shall see. Anyways, the other big thing that is happening in the Jewish world is that, and it's also legal, but it's not in Canada, is that the Israeli Supreme Court officially ended the exemption for yeshiva students who until now had an exemption to not serve in the army. They said that they are now going to have to be drafted, and there is protests about this. All of this stems back to the early days of the founding of the state, where Ben Gurion made a deal that yeshiva students would be exempt from army service. And at the time, there was 400 yeshiva students. And now, at a time when the numbers for the army are increasingly in short supply, and the Haredim are in thousands and thousands and thousands, learning in yeshiva all the time, this has become a big point of contention within Israeli society. This might actually break apart the coalition that is currently being held together by a thread. The defense by the Haredi students is to say that, well, we're studying Torah, which spiritually uplifts the nation and is saving everything spiritually. And you can understand why there are thousands of religious Zionist students that don't believe in that, and millions of non-religious Zionists and Israelis that are like, why should we have to die so that you could spend your days in yeshiva in Israel? And so that's where we're at right now. Yeah, I don't know if that's...
Good summary. Yes, yes. So I had a bunch of questions about this. One is, if you are a woman in a community, a young woman in a community where the men study at yeshiva, the young men, do you serve?
No. There's a thing called Sherut Leumi, which is national service, which women can go towards in that direction as well. I think the exemption is for full-time study. You have to remember that these women are not full-time studying in yeshiva at all, ever.
But I'm saying, do they do some sort of national service?
So in theory, they do have some sort of national service. I'm trying to remember exactly what they do, but they are not as exempt. They just use the national service exemption, which means that they can stay in Jerusalem doing something, teaching, serving in a food pantry or whatever it is.
Right. I didn't mean are they in hand-to-hand combat. I meant, like, in Israel, there's mandatory military service for men and women. So if you are a woman in one of these communities, are you more exempt?
No, so my understanding is that...
Okay, so this is an exemption specifically for certain very observant men.
Yes.
This is okay. So my next question is coming really from, I read the New York Times article about this, and then I read many of the comments, and a lot of the comments were seemingly conflating a couple different categories of people, because they were saying, Like, you want this war, you're this, right winger who wants war, and yet you're not serving in it. And then people were responding and saying, well, these are actually kind of two different, perhaps more than two different groups of people, where there are, on the one hand, religious Zionists, like the settlers one hears about so much, who apparently do serve in the military.
They do, and they're proud of it, and they
serve as reservists and so forth.
The whole way through, yes.
So this is one group of very religious Jews, and then there's another group of very religious Jews who are the ones in the yeshiva not wanting to serve in the IDF. Now, my question for you is, so first of all, two different groups of people,
yes, with
subdivisions within, but does that seem like overall accurate?
Yes.
Okay, so my next question is, in terms of voting, are there people, would you say by and large that a Haredi, or however you're categorizing the people who are studying the yeshivas, are they voting for Netanyahu? Who are they voting for?
No, they vote for their own parties, right? So
okay, and what do those parties want in terms of war?
Well, they're aligned with Netanyahu generally. Okay. They are on the right of things. They probably would say, whether we want a war or not, that's not our fight. That's not our discussion. We're not in it because we don't care about that. The things that we care about, because the Israeli Knesset is so balkanized that you have parties that basically care about one issue and that's all they care about. And they'll vote, their heart's desire based on, whatever it is for all the other issues. The Haredi parties generally care primarily about the issues related to the Haredi world, which is, control of the Israeli rabbinate, the exemptions for the army, anything else related to, the ability to segregate certain buses. This is the kind of things that they want and that they care about. And I would guess that if you had to ask them, should we enter into a war like this, they'd probably be indifferent at most.
Okay, so now more questions. You are the representative of all things observant right now, as always. Basically, obviously, the accusation is that this is sort of freeloading in terms of whatever you're doing in Israel, whether you're interested in military topics or not, whether you're a pundit or not, whatever you're doing, national security is going to matter, because if you're bombed to smithereens, it does not matter, if you're interested in military service as a hobby or not. National security matters not just in Israel, but everywhere, but especially in Israel, right? So is there a sense among the population not serving that there is some sort of moral quandary here, that maybe they should be? Is there a conflict? Are there some Haredi Jews who think here are able-bodied young men, they owe it to the country to do this? So
I think that a lot of them really do believe that they are serving the country by studying in yeshiva. They really do believe this idea, which I will call it right now, it's a canard, right? This notion that by studying, you're bringing merit to the land and thereby helping the land and helping the war and helping all of this stuff, right?
Yes, to my ears, I hear it like if I sit and read a novel instead of doing anything else, I'm really...
Yeah. For example, the last time America had a draft was in Vietnam, and there were exemptions for full-time students, right? This idea that you are studying and you're doing something larger.
And this was controversial, right?
I believe so. But yeah, so in the sense that they care about security, I guess they care about security, but remember that they are in relatively safe neighborhoods or safe cities, right? Jerusalem is not a place that is generally going to be, in the envelope of war because of its proximity, generally, I'm saying. And again, if you believe it, if you really, really believe it, then of course, I'm sure there are people that don't believe it and they're happy to freeload off of everything else.
Right.
But
I don't claim to know anybody's mind. I think I'm saying if you're looking at this from the outside, I think this gets confused with the idea of conscientious objectors or people who have some kind of religious pacifism that would make them not want to serve in the military. But here you look at it and you say, well, clearly you can be an observant Jew and serve in the military, right? That exists.
Yeah, and they believe in war. I mean, the Bible is filled with war. They do. It's not like they're pacifists. They just they think that what they're doing is more important, and that's their thing. And I'm not trying to defend them. I think I want to.
But I think this is. I think your purpose here is to explain it, not to. We don't assume endorse. We just assume.
I excoriate it completely. I think it is a horrible thing. I think that they should absolutely all be serving. I think that people are dying, and they are not, and they're basically getting away with it, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, a part of me feels like, I mean, I'm not serving in the IDF. I'm also probably too old. But, I feel like, am I also freeloading as a Jew, in the diaspora, right?
Yeah, but if you were drafted, you would be taken care of. You would be going draft. You would serve your country, and that's it. And in this case, even if they're not Zionist, right, the fact that they participate in elections, the fact that they pay taxes, and the fact that they live in a land that is protected by other human beings, even if they were living in a secular society, they should be in a non-Jewish society. Even if they were living in America and there was a draft, they should be there battling. They should be there fighting.
But so the other thing I wanted to ask about is I saw some pictures of ultra-observant Jews carrying guns for IDF service. Is this a thing now? Is it happening? Is it on?
I think there have always been Haredi Jews who have served, and the IDF has always made ways for the Haredim to have, units that are there for them, that will give them time to pray, time to study, the food that is up to their level of kosher. So there have always been Haredim that have chosen to serve, but by and large, they have never done so en masse. And so I'm guessing that there are Haredim that walk around with guns, but no different than anybody else who does so in Israel that isn't Haredi. Let's go on to our Nachas or Breigus. Phoebe, do you have Nachas? Do you have Breigus? What do you have for us?
I have some Nachas, which is I listened to the latest, I think it's still the latest, Blocked and Reported podcast. Their latest one is about this amazing, really epic story of a right-wing influencer who was sort of canceled from the right under almost like the exact same terms. It's like this weird, like bizarro mirror of left-wing type people being canceled by their own kind. So she was accused of not really being white, instead of like in the left-wing version of it, where it's somebody who's accused of often, pretending to be a race other than white. She was specifically accused of being Jewish and not white per white supremacists, right? Okay. She was accused of having once held kind of liberal political views. Okay, so the purity politics angle.
No, yes.
And it's just really interesting the way these kind of very online communities and with offline in-person elements as well, how it is just sort of exactly the same on both extremes. And that was just super interesting to listen to. Avi, what have you got?
I have a Nachas. I don't want this to sound too heady. I just started wading my toes into Charles Taylor's latest book, Cosmic Connections, Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment. Charles Taylor, for those of you who don't know, there are two Charles Taylors. One was a Liberian despot. We're not talking about him. Although apparently that guy converted to Judaism at some point, or claimed to have converted to Judaism while standing trial in The Hague. That's a story for a different time. Charles Taylor is a philosopher at McGill University. He is in his 90s, and he just wrote a masterwork, as I can tell. I mean, I'm only 20, 30 pages in. It is really heady stuff. It's really slow going in terms of reading. But fear not. You don't have to read it all. All you have to do is go to The New Yorker, where Adam Gopnik, we are fans of Adam Gopnik on this show.
Are we?
You're not a fan? I don't know. I like him. Regardless, he did a review of this book, which is masterful, in The New Yorker. Read that. It will give you a great sense of what this book is about. It's ostensibly about poetry and music. It's about so much more. Great show again, as always, Phoebe.
Absolutely. Thanks, Avi.
Happy Canada Day as a Canadian.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending June 29th, Shabbat Parashat Shalach. The show is produced by Michael Freeman and edited by Zach Hoffman. Our music is by So Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Sack!
Redmond, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.